Good evening, everybody. This is new for me, so we'll see how this goes. So hang in there. A couple things. I'm going to probably go through this fairly quickly because a lot of this stuff won't pertain to anything but a little bit of testing. And I don't believe there's a whole lot on testing about operations, but there might be some. So if you have any questions, feel free to get a hold of me. There's a couple ways. My cell phone, 208-983-6393. Again, 983-6393. Or you can email me at wdbill@hotmail.com. And you can always call me at the hospital too. So, okay, let's get started. So we're going to go over transport operations. Okay, thanks, Zach. So operations is knowledge of operational roles to ensure patient, public, and personal safety. So again, it gets back to the SABCS's scene safety, personal safety. One thing I would recommend that you guys do in the future, even if you're not running with us, is the Idaho Department of Transportation now has a class on incident and traffic management, and it's a pretty good class. Tells you how to handle and how to park when things are kind of crazy out there on the highway. You want to also remember to wear appropriate reflective gear at night, and just like we talked about, scene safety and personal safety, always keep lookout for yourself and your coworkers. So you've got a lot of risk and responsibilities with emergency response, risk and responsibility with transport, and then air medical. You guys should try to log on eventually to Idaho Train. You can go to the EMS website, Idaho EMS website, go on to Train Idaho, and they actually have a online landing zone operator course that I'd highly recommend for you. So I will tell you that under the risk and responsibilities of emergency response, that out of every 100 people that get sued for inappropriate EMS work out there throughout the nation, probably over 96-98% of that is for driving. You got to remember that you can't drive code or, with full lights and sirens going at 90 miles an hour responding to somebody with a broken leg or a headache or a stomach ache. So you need to make sure that if you're going faster than that you really pay attention to why, and can you defend that in a court of law. So medicine applies to the fundamental knowledge, and you guys should be able to pretty well do that now. And we'll get you some more practicals to bring you into gear there. Infectious disease, that should be on everybody's mind tonight, especially after the last few days, with the COVID outbreak. I told how much worse can it get the other day, because had COVID all day, deal with here at the hospital. We actually haven't had a positive case through here yet, but you're still dealing with all of the preparation and everything. Then it snows, and I have to go shovel snow out here. And to top it off, I just get home, and I'm getting ready to relax, and then there's a flipping earthquake. So, what the hell? And then I hear later that there was a tornado over in the Tri-Cities by Richland. So, I don't know, maybe the Lord's trying to tell us something. Let's calm down. So, again, most ambulances are stocked with standard medical supplies. You guys that are not with Grangeville Ambulance, and Zach has to do with this too, but both him and I have to deal with making sure we have minimal standards on each vehicle to service and become a licensed ambulance service. So every ambulance service should have a little bit of a driver's policy, in my opinion. And the other thing I'd recommend, and again, a lot of this ain't following the slides that I've got up there, but we have a pretty strong policy that we don't use sirens very often. There's a place for sirens, but most of the time, if you look at the statistics, sirens cause a lot more accidents and injury than running without them. We run lights, but sirens have been proven to cause a lot more accidents. So some of the emergency vehicle design has changed over the years. There's enlarged patient compartments. Some of these vehicles now, you'll see ambulances mounted on, 2.5 ton trucks with 4 doors, and they're huge. I don't see that working in our area. Some of these mountain roads, we can barely turn around the ones we have now. But there's a lot of new changes with the emergency design. Making the compartments from the driver's compartment with airbags, the patient compartment big enough for 2 EMTs and 2 supine patients. A lot of them now are not only allowing 1 supine patient, because that's all they can transport safely. There's 4-point harnesses in the back of a lot of the new ambulances. Our new ambulance, we actually installed 2 4-point, 1 3-point with a built-in child seat on one. So those are some of the designs that are changing the way the back of ambulances and the way ambulances are built, along with crash data. So you've got 3 different types of ambulance. Type 1 is a conventional truck and cab chassis. That's like on a Ford, it'd be the F-Series. Type 2 is a van. That would be like the E-Series. And Type 3 is just strictly like a little van, and they're very limited on room. So ambulance license or certification are established by the state. In Idaho, it's run by the Idaho EMS Association, Idaho EMS Bureau, and they do that once a year, and again they do an inspection and come in and visit with you about your minimum supply list and things like that. The Star of Life emblem is affixed to the sides, rear, and roof of the ambulance for easy identification. And just FYI, there's actually been some people who have bought used ambulances and they've not taken that Star of Life off, and they've I don't know if they've been ticketed, but they've been given warnings. So again, top left corner is kind of a Type 1. Down at the bottom is your Type 2, and then the Type 3 smaller van type is in the upper right. So the different phases of a call is preparation for a call. Okay, and what I think comes into mind there, importantly for us, because we're not in the station, so that's kind of different, and we all respond from home. But perhaps that preparation is strictly getting out the appropriate clothing and boots and gloves and hats, depending on the weather. Okay, then you're going to get the dispatch, and I got to be honest with you, dispatch can only put out what they get in, and so sometimes we'll complain about that was a terrible dispatch, wasn't anything like that when we got to the scene. But keep in mind that that's just what they were given. They're not making it up, and so they're pretty good about trying to get as good information as possible. And if you keep asking, we work closely with dispatch with the radio system, and I think it's worked pretty well. So en route is where you guys need to start doing your pre-planning, especially if it's something critical. Who's going to do what? What are we going to do when we first arrive on scene? Arrival at the scene should be your first look at scene safety. Okay? Where are we going to station the ambulance? What are we going to do? And then how are we going to get the patient to the ambulance? And then en route to the receiving facility and the transport, that's when you're also going to have to give your report to the receiving facility, and then delivery at the facility, back en route to the station, which is tough for us because it's a half a block away, and then your post-run work, which means taking care of restocking the ambulances, the QRUs or whatever you're in, getting it ready for the next call, and also doing your patient care reports. So in the preparation, kind of go over what we didn't cover maybe earlier, but make sure all your equipment and supplies are in place. No items are missing or at work. Store new equipment after proper instructions on its use, and it should be durable and standardized. One thing we've worked hard here at Grangeville with is we've tried to standardize the exact layout between our 2 ambulances. So if you need a bag valve mask, it's going to be in the same general location usually the same exact cabinet in both ambulances. So if you're familiar with one, you're going to be familiar with the other. Because a lot of times you'll be out in the primary call 911 ambulance probably an average of 3 times or 4 times to your 1 time in the ambulance too. So get the equipment stored, make sure it works. You know, you need to be checking some of this stuff as you put it back together. One of my pet peeves is people get done with the call, they replace all the canisters on the suction unit, but they don't check the suction unit. And so then when you go to use it in a true emergency, what happens is maybe one of the caps are off and now the suction unit won't work. So spend a little time preparing for your next crew coming on shift. Again, this is a little different in the big paid units because that's the first thing they do when they come in to be on call all day is go top to bottom through the ambulances. That doesn't happen as much in volunteer agencies. So again, the cabinet should be transparent and labeled. We do both. Think that works good. And again, the same cabinet that have the 4x4s and the Curlex will be in the same place in both ambulances. So you want to know where your portable suction is, your CPR boards, you know, basic wound supply, splitting supplies. You know, we keep all of that in the same cabinet on the outside of the ambulance. You know, where your childbirth kits are and the AEDs. Under the medical equipment, you got to keep in mind your patient transfer equipment, your medications, and your jump kits. In our unit, we carry 3 different jump kits. We carry one for trauma, one for medical or mostly medical calls in town, and then we have a 3rd jump kit that's strictly pediatric. So you also have to have your personal safety equipment and equipment for work areas. You should have your vest, your high-vis vest for out on the highway. You also should have your PPE, and right now that's going to be gowns, goggles, and N95 masks, plus some common masks to put on the patient themselves. That's kind of the standard PPE for droplet protection with the coronavirus. Okay. Safety and operations equipment, pre-planning, navigation equipment. Make sure everybody knows how to use the navigation equipment. We don't pack extrication, it's a separate vehicle, but if you do, you need to know where it's at, and you should have training on extrication before you just grab those jaws of life and try to use them, or you could easily become the next victim. So by law, you have to have at least 1 EMT in the patient compartment during transport. Just recently, though, there is a update for people who have the first responder classification. They can do, it's kind of a modified optional module, I believe, and they can actually then be the transport in the back instead of an EMT. We try to run with a 3-person crew, you know, and the reason for that is a lot of the places we go, we don't have anybody there to help lift. And you'll find out as you get into this that lifting is a lot of what you're going to be doing out there. And people don't always fall in places where you can use appropriate back safety and, you know, all of the different things we learn about protecting our lower spine, you know, and it seems like it's always in a trailer house in between the wall and the toilet somewhere where there's barely room to get one person in. And you think I'm exaggerating, but I know over the years I've taken off several doors just to get patients out of a single room. So you can run with a non-EMT driver and a single EMT in the patient compartment. If you're doing that, I highly recommend that your driver have some kind of first aid and definitely have CPR training to help you in those cases. Daily inspections, you know, check them for cleanliness, quality, quantity of all the medical equipment and supplies. Review the safety precautions. One thing you guys will find out that if you are responding to your vehicle, you are not under any real coverage. If you crash, you could be held responsible for all of that damage even though you maybe had your four-way flashers on. So work with your particular units and find out what their policy is. Ensure safety devices are in working orders. You should have things like flashlight, the high-vis vest we talked about. Another thing that I think is important, believe it or not, is the little yak track type things, or something that you can put on your feet to stand on those highways. You think I'm kidding, but there are actually times when we couldn't stand on highways. We were sliding around. We were trying to throw gravel up there so we could work on the patient, but we were sliding all over. Properly secure oxygen tanks. Remember that when those small oxygen tanks are full, they're at 2,000 pounds. We trade our small ones out at 1,000 pounds. If that gets tipped over or knocked over or falls off of the back of a pickup and that valve gets broke off, you've now created a small missile. And so it'll go through people, through vehicles, through steel, and it can be very hazardous. So the other thing that I think is important is in ambulances, in particular, is to properly secure the equipment in the cab, the rear compartments, especially your defibrillators. If you've got a larger defibrillator like an LP12 or an LP15, it's important that you keep that in some kind of bracket, because God forbid if you're ever in a rollover, you don't want one of those flying at your head. So dispatch phase, they're always available 24 hours a day. They're going to be operated by the sheriff's department in our area. They serve multiple jurisdictions. So keep that in mind when you're on the radio, that you're not the only dog out there in the fight. There could be law enforcement, fire, everybody involved in a particular incident. And on mass casualty incidents, we want to actually switch over some kind of tactical channel, so we're not tying up that major frequency that's used for dispatch by the Grangeville Dispatch Center here at the Idaho County Sheriff's Department. So the dispatcher gathers and records the nature of the call, the present location, callback numbers, what they can find as far as the location of the patient. It might just be an address, number of patients, severity of conditions, and any other pertinent information they can get. En route to the scene is the most dangerous phase for the EMTs. Again, crashes cause many serious injuries. Not only can you get sued because you went too fast to the scene, but again, imagine how bad it would be if you rolled that ambulance because you were going too fast for an inappropriate reason in particular, and now one of your crew members was seriously injured. And keep in mind, there's stupid people out there. You can be doing your really good job of defensive driving on your ambulance, and you pull up behind them. You can have the siren going, the lights going, and you could follow that person for a long ways. Don't pass on a blind corner just because you got lights and sirens going, because the people coming the other way can't see you. And the other thing, if you're following behind a vehicle, keep in mind, and this happens all the time, that when they do see your lights, their first initial response is just to slam on the brakes, whether they're on a blind corner, middle of the highway, whatever. Now all of a sudden you've got to stop and try to wait till it's safe to go on around them. So again, review the dispatch and make your plans amongst your crew members on what to do when you get there. Arrival at the scene, again, you're going to be doing your scene size up as you roll up there. And part of that, if I'm going to backtrack just a minute, en route to the scene, depending on what you hear from dispatch and perhaps from bystanders, or in our case, a Whitebird QRU or another QRU on scene, that might be the time that we decide amongst ourselves, this sounds bad enough, let's launch air medical before we even get on scene. We don't have advantage of launching ALS around here, but we can definitely launch helicopters. And we do that sometime prior to being on scene. And even without a QRU there, if what dispatch gives us the information, that they've rolled down a very steep embankment, or multiple people injured, we'll use that to make an educated guess on whether or not we should pre-launch a helicopter. So, again, when you arrive at scene, you got to look for those safety hazards, evaluate your needs for additional units, look at your MOI or NOI, mechanism of injury, nature of illness. Again, SABCS, do you need spinal immobilization? And always follow your standard precautions for your personal safety. Am I talking too fast, Zach?
You're doing great.
Okay. So, mass casualty incidents, you roll up on one of those, you're going to learn some new cuss words. I'll tell you that. So, you got to estimate and communicate the number of patients to the incident commander, and additional units requested through dispatch. We also use state communication here, and they do an excellent job of helping us manage major mass casualty incident. The one thing I would add to that is that any of you who are not familiar with incident command or the incident command system, we need to get you through that. The other thing I don't believe we've had a chance to cover in here is start triage.
We did cover it.
Oh, did you? Yeah. Okay. Sounds like you guys did cover it. I didn't see that. So keep familiar with that start triage. That's going to be one you use on scene. And once we get all caught up, and maybe we can get together a few times, I actually have an old video of a incident that was done years ago. And although it's dated, it does a good job of describing how you want to set up a transfer location, an equipment bank, the triage system, a transport officer, all of those things. So a lot of learning to do. And one thing I will mention, because I did think about this tonight, kind of preparing in my mind for this, one of the last classes, is that EMS is a changing field. And if you really want to be proficient at it and engaged in it, you need to go to some continuing ed as often as you can try to make it. Because it seems like even though some of it's old hat and you've heard it before, it's a good reminder. And it seems like out of every continuing ed, I at least take home 1 or 2 jewels. It's kind of like I had you do with the whiteboards, or Zach did too. What was your jewel for the night? So, like I was talking about with ITD, that you need to be thinking about how to safely park. Before or after the crash scene, do not park alongside. If you've got hazardous materials, you want to always be uphill and upwind of those. Leave your warning lights on and devices on. With some of the new LED lights, they are so bright that sometimes on scene it's best to drop down to what's called a secondary position on that, which basically uses your red lights and not as many white lights, so people aren't blinded as they go by you. And keep a safe distance between the emergency vehicles and the operation. Remember, there could always be some crazy person driving by at 65 miles an hour in the middle of an accident scene. So before you ever step out where you're not protected by other vehicles, always look around the corner and be ready to react. I'm sure all of you have seen some of those close calls of police officers from their dash cam, and that just goes to show that it happens. Tow truck drivers are injured. They have one of the worst injury rates out on the scene of anybody. So this kind of gives you some ideas on how to park. I'm not going to get into this too deep, but I think once we get everything settled on this COVID and everything, we'll try to bring that incident traffic management course to Grangeville, and highly recommend it. So stay away from fires, explosive hazards, downed wires, unstable structures. Set the parking brake. Think about parking so you can facilitate emergency care, rapid transport with the scene. If you have to, don't be afraid to block traffic. And you can also, I've used bystanders if they feel like they're capable and are willing to volunteer for that, to walk up the road with a flashlight or something and try to get people to slow down, especially if it's on a blind corner. So, scene safety first, just like the top line there. Traffic control is intended to ensure orderly traffic flow, warn other drivers, and prevent another crash. So, keep yourself safe out there. Part of the minimum equipment list on ambulances are the foldable triangular warning. They're not flares, they're just warning reflectors. You want to be careful if you have somebody that says, I'll put out flares. Think about that and be careful. Make sure if they're going to do that, it's uphill, because remember, gasoline, diesel flows down the highway quite a ways in these, and you don't want a flare burning down there. Okay, transfer phase is when the patient is packaged for transport. You want to secure the patient to the backboard or scoop just to be able to lift them up. The other thing we talked about was the mega mover that works really good. Get a C-collar on them if it's appropriate and you're worried about traumatic injury with C-spine injuries. And then safely lift the patient into the compartment. So the number one injury that disables any EMS personnel is back injuries. So always be willing to call for extra help. Get bystanders to grab on the side of the gurney. Make sure they know that you're going to be the one calling the shot. We're going to lift on 3. Make sure you describe how that's going to happen. Make sure they know where to grab so they're not pinched as you load a gurney. And make sure your patient's secured well. But again, make sure that you don't injure yourself and now you've got a bad back for the rest of your life, because it does happen. So when you're ready to leave the patient, inform dispatch of the number of patients, name of receiving hospital, and we don't do the mileage of the ambulance. I don't know if I've never heard anybody in our area do that. But basically, we're just going to call our dispatch here in Idaho County and tell them we're en route to the hospital. Then we'll get to a different frequency and let the hospital we're coming in, and again, we'll give them the number of patients, the condition of the patients, and our estimated time of arrival. So remember, on your en route, that's where you may or may not, depending on the priority of that patient, be doing your secondary assessment. You're going to be rechecking a stable patient every 15 minutes. And if you guys forget this during your practical test, Zach and I will beat about the head with a rubber hose or something, because you got to remember to recheck unstable patients every 5 minutes. Every 5 minutes. Don't forget that. Okay. Again, contact the receiving hospital. And do not abandon the patient emotionally. Remember, you're showing up on probably this person, male or female, worst day of their life. And you've got to remember how to handle that. And sometimes it can be tough on you, but you've got to be strong for the patient. Don't lie to them. Tell them, you can let them know it's serious. But if, just be careful not to lie to them. And especially if you've got something you've got to do, some kind of intervention that's going to hurt, you need to let them know that. Even a small child, you always let them know it's going to hurt, but not for very long, or what exactly is going to happen. So, delivery phase is, you notice the dispatch of your arrival at the hospital. They may or may not be a triage nurse. In a mass casualty, there will be a triage nurse, and they will maybe send you to a different location with a code green patient versus a code red. And then physically transport the patient from your cot or gurney onto the ER bed. Try to present a complete verbal report, and then later on you'll complete your detailed patient care report and restock items if possible. In small facilities, whether it's Cottonwood or Grangeville, Clearwater Valley, you may or may not be asked to stay by and offer additional assistance at the ER. Okay. Route to the station, you're going to let dispatch know, especially like on inter-facility transports for us where we go to Liston or Spokane or Coeur d'Alene, Boise, whatever. We're going to let them know when we are out of the area. We're also going to let the dispatch know when we're back in service, so they can kind of keep track that, oh, Grangeville has an ambulance in Liston, Cottonwood has an ambulance in Coeur d'Alene, so if there's a mass casualty around here, I've only got 2 ambulances to call from immediately, and I'm going to have to reach out further to get more help coming. So back at the station, you want to clean, disinfect the ambulance and equipment, and restock supplies, and kind of go over that. Another thing I recommend on restocking supplies is if you've got someone who's willing to do it, get somebody set up to go through and do a complete inventory, at least quarterly if possible. And that's a good time to bring on a new EMT or a new responder and have them help with that inventory, because I guarantee you if they help go through item by item, they'll learn where everything's stored. So just a little thing that I use to help people do that. Post-run phase. Okay, you're going to complete and file additional reports. We don't inform dispatch again, so maybe in some cities you do. Perform routine inspections, and if needed, refuel the vehicle. So, key terms here is cleaning, disinfectant, high-level disinfection, depending on what you have, not only with something along the line as COVID, but if you have a lot of feces involved, there's another one called C. diff, and that's going to take some high-level disinfectant. And a lot of the wipes we use will not control C. diff. I think we covered that earlier, and you have to use a bleach solution. And some items might even have to be re-sterilized. After each call, we do it at the ambulance. Actually, we do it at the hospital. We strip the linens from the stretcher, replace them, and discard medical waste. Wash the contaminated areas with soap and water. Wipes, the purple wipes work pretty good for also decontaminating areas like that. And they work good on the COVID. They just don't work on C. diff. So, disinfect all non-disposable equipment for patient care. That would include like blood pressure cuffs, pulse oximetry, things along that line. Clean the stretcher, get it cleaned up. Don't forget the straps. If there's blood involved, you want to kind of do a double take, check the underside, maybe lift your mattress up, make sure nothing's rolled underneath the mattress. Because with blood in particular, with hepatitis, that can stay on there for days. I mean, I think it's up to 20 days or something like that now. And just from dried blood. Once it dries, normally a lot of the viruses like HIV and stuff like that, once the blood dries, that virus dies. But Hep C is not one of those. Okay, clean any spillages or contamination with one of those of the same solution, and make sure to clean up the floor in your ambulance. One thing I think is important is your appearance and the appearance of your vehicle as you show up. If somebody shows up with it might be old, but if it's clean, looks well maintained, the staff looks professional as they roll out, I think it's going to tend to give your patient a feeling of comfort that this is a professional group and they're going to do a good job for you. Now, I understand as volunteers, there's times when we can't necessarily show up with clean jeans on and stuff like that because we've been working on a diesel truck or something like that. But you can always have a clean vest or something like that on over the outside, so you give that professionalism look. If you guys want to, it's always nice to go with what's presented on your particular piece of equipment on how to clean it, and you can use that procedure pretty well. So defensive ambulance driving and techniques, that delays patient care. Again, it can take the lives of EMTs and motorists. Not too long ago, I think it's been about 3 years ago, New Meadows ambulances was headed south on 95, and a vehicle crossed the center line and actually crashed into them and somewhat head on, forced them over the bank. I believe they rolled, didn't they? Yeah, and they were two elderly EMTs in there. They were out of service for a long time. They had minimal EMTs on their unit already, so that was really tough for them to manage. Plus, they had a vehicle that was totaled, so keep that in mind. We do not require emergency vehicle, but if you get a chance to attend one of those, I'd recommend it. Down in Lewiston, and they'll usually cut you a pretty good deal if you get groups of like 3 to 12, and they'll only take 3 at a time. But Lewis and Clark has a skid class that a lot of the police officers take, and I highly recommend that. And you get to drive in like a SUV, and then they put you in a truck, which would be more similar to an ambulance, and they'll have you run through this course. They'll actually pick the wheels up so you have very little contact with the surface, so you're broad sliding, how to get out of that. They'll talk to you about the appropriate way to use anti-lock brakes, all of that stuff. I will mention to you with anti-lock brakes, one thing to keep in mind, whether it's an ambulance or on your own personal vehicle, always mash the brake down first and then steer out of it. Don't try to steer first and then brake. Those anti-lock brakes are made to work with you smashing the brake down first and then steering out of it. I like this saying, speed does not save lives, good care does. I know that in several of our classes we talked about high flow diesel as being the thing we need to run, but we do it when it's safe. We never want to push the limits, and if you've got a driver that don't feel comfortable at the speed you'd like to see, don't push them. And try to make it work out to where everybody stays safe and goes home to their family at night. Keep in mind that this vehicle's different than the vehicles you drive. Okay, it's not the same as driving a 3/4 or 1-ton truck. It's like driving a 3/4 or 1-ton truck with about 40 sheets of plywood standing upright in the back of the pickup when you get in a windstorm. Okay, it's going to sway, it's going to move. You want to keep in mind that crosswinds can be terrible. Just going across a prairie and going through the cuts out there on the highway, you come out of the cut and that gust comes and hits you, you'll feel that push your ambulance around. Okay, so keep that in mind. The other thing is brakes, and that's not on this slide, but I think it's really important to address. You're driving on these vehicles, whether it's a 3/4 ton pickup or 1.5 or 1.25 clear up to a 2-ton truck that an ambulance is on, and most of these are loaded within very few pounds of being up to their total max gross vehicle capabilities. So if you head down Whitebird Hill, if you're coming off of Deer Creek or going into Pittsburgh Landing, if you don't gear down, again, speed doesn't save lives, you're going to end up being the next one being taken care of, or having to call for another ambulance because you've burnt the brakes up and had to put it in the ditch just to stop. So remember, learn how to gear down. If you don't understand how to do it with your particular vehicle, a lot of them have tow haul buttons on it. That works. Some of them have the button that you can actually shift down. But if you're pushing on that brake too much, you're going to burn those brakes out, and especially on long climbs. And if you're coming down out of Deer Creek or down into Pittsburgh, some of those corners are going to be pretty non-forgiving if you don't have brakes to slow you down. Oh, I never got a chance to look at these slides ahead of time. So here's something about siren risk, benefit analysis. So we run with our emergency lights on almost always, but the sirens we don't. And again, that depends on local protocols, patient condition, and anticipated clinical outcome of the patient. Okay, so you got to weigh all of that. And again, I think sirens are well served when you need to get someone to turn around to pull over, to get them to move out of your way. Use little blips and beeps on your ambulance, but don't run it full time. I've found it more effectively to just, if I get behind somebody and they're not pulling over, then to hit the siren. The other thing that'll help when you're using that siren is to change the tones. Most of these new ambulances have at least 3 different distinctive ambulance siren tones. So if one isn't getting their attention, switch to another. It might overcome the extra loud bass that's in the radio up ahead of you. So, always assume that motorists and vehicles have not heard your siren in public address system or seen you. Our protocols stand for you pull up to a red stoplight or a red stop sign. You actually have to stop, make eye contact with the people that are on the other side before proceeding. Okay, so you always drive defensively. Maintain a safe following distance from the vehicle. That's going to be something like I told you earlier, because sometimes when they do see you, they'll just slam on the brakes. And the first time that happens to you, it'll really get your attention. Try to avoid being tailgated from behind. I'm not quite sure how you can do that. We've actually had to call the cops because we'll have people tailgate us because we're doing maybe 70, 75 on a transfer critical to Lewiston, and they think that's a good way for them to get to Lewiston faster. They'll just fall in behind the ambulance, and if they meet a police officer, they'll think they're family or something like that. So be careful of those tailgaters, because what will happen is you'll go around somebody who's pulled over, the person will start pulling back out into traffic, and now this vehicle that was tailgating you is right there in that line of traffic. And it's crazy. Never get out of the ambulance to confront a driver. I never have, but there's been a few times I really wanted to, but I haven't. And be aware of blind spots, especially in these bigger vehicles. There's places when you want to change lanes and stuff like that that you can't see. So you want to be able to use not only your regular side mirrors, but also your concave side mirrors that give you a better shot at that. Excessive speed, that's pretty much common sense. So make sure that you are doing it appropriately. Sometimes we'll have to have you slow down to provide patient care in the compartment. Increases your time and distance needed to stop. Again, just use common sense and be safe out there. Siren syndrome, again, that can actually cause a driver to drive faster due to increased anxiety, not even realizing it. Vehicle size and distance judgment. We just talked about the size of these vehicles and how they respond in wind and corners. They also don't stop like your little SUVs and stuff like that. Again, they're loaded to pretty close to their maximum vehicle capacity, and it's going to take a little bit for them to get stopped. Okay, this gives you an idea of how to apex early when you're entering a lane, exit early. When turning, enter high in the lane, exit low. That's going to help on the way these corners. So, weather and road conditions, you guys have all lived in Idaho long enough, I think you know how that's going to impact things. Be aware of hydroplaning. That can cause you problems. We've actually had multiple times, and primarily on Whitebird grade, where we tried to stop the ambulance. We weren't going fast. We were down to 5 miles an hour or less. But when we went to go to a complete stop, the ambulance just kept sliding. And that was even with some studded tires on. So sometimes, if you run into that, you might have to pull over and get into the gravel areas on the side of the road just to be able to stop your ambulance. So don't wait to find that out until you're right up next to the crash scene. You want to do that and get stopped early and then slowly proceed. Again, if you're on an emergency call and you're using your warning lights and siren, you may be able to do the following. Park or stand in an illegal location. Proceed through a red light or stoplight. I already told you what our policy is on that. Drive faster than the speed limit. Our standard protocol is not to exceed 10 miles over the speed limit. Occasionally, you might have to drive against the flow of traffic and travel left of center to make an illegal pass. An emergency vehicle, however, is never allowed to pass a school bus that stopped to load or unload children. Use of warning lights and siren. The unit must be a true emergency call. Like I told you, if you get in an accident running lights and sirens at a high speed and you're going to somebody who fell last night and been laying there all night, that might be a hard one to defend in court. Why you were proceeding that quickly with all your audio-visual stuff going, or somebody who's just fell and might have even just a broken hip, or a broken arm, Now you got somebody who's got anaphylaxis or cardiac issues or respiratory issues or diabetic emergency, then that's going to change your response. Emergency vehicles have the right to disregard the rules of the road when responding to an emergency. Okay? That's kind of up for discussion because you have to have a reason to be doing that, an appropriate reason. Do not endanger people or property, and get to know your local right-of-way privileges. Use of escorts. We have used police a few times to escort us on a real critical trauma run or cardiac run to help clear traffic ahead of us. Intersection hazards are your most common and most serious. Again, I think you should stop for the traffic light and come to a brief stop, look for pedestrian and other hazards, and try to make eye contact with the oncoming traffic in the lane that's got the right-of-way. Okay. Highways, unpaved roads, school zones. You want to be careful not to exceed the limit in school zones. Unpaved roads. Again, if you're not familiar with driving on gravel roads, driving code at the front of an ambulance on one first or second trip out on gravel roads is probably not where you need to be. Be careful of distractions. You want to be careful of GPS, looking at your phone for GPS. I recommend having verbal commands from your GPS so you don't have to look at your phone or your GPS unit. Be familiar with your mounted mobile radio so you don't even have to look down. You can pick it up and talk without even looking down at it. Stereo, cell phones, eating, drinking, all of those can come into play. Again, focus on figuring out the safest route while mentally preparing for your call. Demand your complete attention and focus. One thing I'll mention with that is sometimes we're doing a lot of stuff that pushes our boundaries. You might start out on a call, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon or evening, after spending a full day at work, and you might have a 2-hour run, say into Pittsburgh Landing, which would probably be closer to 2.5 hours. Then you get back, and now they say you got to go to Liston or Spokane or Coeur d'Alene. So keep in mind that you need to work with your partners. If you get to the point you're feeling too drowsy to drive or something like that, make sure you talk about that. Don't be afraid to switch things up if need be. But keep that in mind. That's probably one of the things I think can get us all just pushing our limits. Fatigue, like I just talked to you about. Air medical operations, you got fixed wings and rotary units. We're probably in the position where we're going to use fixed wings, where a lot of you guys in Whitebird and well, Cottonwood gets in fixed wings occasionally to their airport there too. But you need to be familiar with those. I think it's really important that you take that landing zone officer class. Even if you're not the landing zone officer, it's going to teach you a lot about safe approaches to helicopters. You know, you never approach back by the tail rotor, you know, and you're usually looking at a 10 to 2 approach, you know, and if you're pulling a vehicle up to unload, you got to stay at least 2 times your estimated distance from the rotor, because they don't get real happy if you have the rotor hit you back your ambulance. So air medicals are usually ran by specialized trained crews. EMTs provide the ground support. We set up landing zones for them out in the field sometimes, and again, that class will tell you how to do that safely. Medevac is performed by helicopters from the scene. The one thing I will tell you that MedStar and stuff cannot do retrieval, and that's where they have to long line somebody out. They have to find a landing zone, and they would have to hike in or do something like that. So if you've got somebody that's going to need to be retrieved, my suggestion is be familiar on having Grangeville Dispatch contact Two Bear Air out of Whitefish, Montana, or the 101st Division out of Gowan Field down there. Both of them have long line retrieval capabilities. So basically, what are you going to call it? Most ambulance service have to have written air medical protocols. I'd be happy to share that if any of you don't. I'd be happy to share mine with you. So a lot of its transport time by ground is too long. We talked during the class multiple times about the golden hour and the platinum 10 minutes. If this person is needing surgery, we want to get them to that surgeon's table as soon as possible. So that's one good reason to use a helicopter or air transport. Road traffic environmental conditions prohibit the use of ground transport. That's a backcountry call, and I've had to do that a time or two. Probably the primary reason is this third bullet point. The patient requires advanced care. Okay, you need that advanced ALS life support to come in there and help. You might need intubation. You might need drugs, pain medication, whatever. And the other reason to use them is like in a mass casualty or something like that, where you have multiple patients and limited resources, and you just need to be able to get people transported. Again, you guys can read this, but patients with time-dependent injuries, stroke, heart attack, sepsis, trauma, drownings, trauma patients, candidates for limb replantation, and anybody with severe burns. Hyperbaric chamber would kind of go along with that burn. Venomous bite center, you know, for the most part we're dealing with rattlesnakes, so that's not necessarily what I would call an air medical operation. But it could be if they're far enough back in the wilderness. So to get that launched, you can call the dispatch. We actually can dispatch life flight from our ambulance if we need to. If we've got cell service, we can do that. And you can also, if you can't get a hold of Grangeville Dispatch, you can contact Boise Communications on frequency 2 and have them help you get them dispatched. So I'm not going to go over these landing zone things because I think it's more important that you guys go through that class. So, because it does a lot better job than me talking about it. I will tell you that all the helicopter services around here don't want you to be doing these signs shown on this slide. Okay? They want you to probably mostly have a radio in your hand and communicate
Get
with
out
them.
of the way.
Yeah, or just get the hell out of the way, like Zach said. Okay, night landings. Again, you don't want to get your lights in the air. You don't want to shine flashlights. You want to keep everything low because most of these are coming in using night goggles, night vision goggles, and bright lights shining up actually makes them blind, and they're not able to see as well. So, again, the landing zone officer class covers this a lot more, but again, you need to know which side to approach from, which area to approach from. Remember, if they're on a hill, that rotor's going to be a lot closer to you on that uphill side. Everybody needs to know about hazardous materials. Notify the flight crew. You actually should try to notify them about any hazardous materials if you can prior to them getting on scene, so you can get them the best approach and distance from the scene. Just like with our ambulances, if you've got hazardous materials, it's always uphill and upwind, and you're going to decontaminate the patients before loading them into the helicopter. So with that said, if you've got a patient that's contaminated, I recommend never putting them in your ambulance. First off, it's unsafe for you, it's unsafe for your teammates, and it's going to contaminate that ambulance to where you might not be able to use it. So how are you going to decontaminate them on scene? So probably the best way to do it is call and have your local fire department come and create a fog with their fire truck and have that patient, as hopefully their modesty is going to be a high level so they don't mind it, but they're going to have to strip, walk through that fog, and get clean before you're going to allow them in the back of the ambulance. Because if you take a contaminated patient in the back of your ambulance, you might be taking that ambulance out of service for a day, a week, a month, who knows what. Could even be forever. But make sure to decontaminate your patients prior to doing that. If there's the best way to do that, again, in my opinion, in our rural area, is call the fire department to come. Usually their water is at least going to be room temperature, but when this patient comes out of there, be ready to address them getting cold and possible hypothermia, because you're going to want to get them covered up and warm right away. If they're non-ambulatory, it might be somebody from the crew is going to have to do the same thing, go in that fog and help get that patient cleaned up, get their clothes off them, because clothes hold a lot of the contaminants, and then bring them out. And both of you will have to get warm clothing or warm blankets when you get out of there. And actually, that's actually happened to me when you've had to go in the river. So, assess the severity of weather, environment, terrain. Helicopters are limited to not much above 10,000 feet. A lot of that can be significantly lower than that, depending on the heat. So remember, airplanes and helicopters fly better in cold, clear conditions versus hot, clear conditions. The hotter the temperature, the less lift there is in the air. Sometimes the medevac won't be able to take as many patients or size of patients. We've had situations, one that sticks in my mind was one clear up at Square Mountain, where they actually had to offload a crew member to pick up the patient and being able to lift up, and they actually delivered the patient to the hospital and then went back and picked up their crew member. So again, they're very limited at high elevations. So Okay. I don't think we'll go through the review, but I'll kind of page through them here, and you guys can look at this and determine your answer. So I'm just going to slowly page through these. Do they have the capability to pause this?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I'm going to page through these a little bit quicker. But Zach says you guys have the ability to pause this. So as you go through these, you can pause these answers and questions so you know what the correct call was. Some of these are made more for urban areas than the rural areas. Our one-way road might be a mountain road that not wide enough for creeks to pass when they meet each other. I think we're about to wrap these up. Okay, so that concludes that. I just have a few closing remarks and see what Zach has. So, under your homework from me, anyway, is to go in as you guys get time, and it might be a while before we can get you into test in the Pearson View testing centers and stuff like that, and get your practicals done. But it sounds like we might be able to give you a provisionary license. But anyway, I would like to see you go. The easiest way to get there is to go to the Idaho EMS website. On their homepage will be a link to Train Idaho. You'll have to create an account. I don't think you have to be a licensed EMT to get on that. I would recommend that you take the Hazmat Awareness course and the Landing Zone Officer course. You can also scroll through their offerings as far as other courses. Most of them take about an hour, hour and a half at the most to go through. And I'd recommend you guys taking advantage of that. The main thing I will tell you before you get prepped and think you're ready to conquer the world with your testing and everything, and I can't stress it enough, is to go out and get some practice online tests. I do think that Limmer one is probably one of the better ones, but perhaps you guys could communicate amongst yourselves by email and share logins. There's no reason you couldn't do that. So maybe one person gets Limmer, one gets one out of another Brady or something else. But I think that's really, really important to practice doing that, because of two reasons. It's going to teach you how to take those computerized courses. It's going to show you how to do that, picking the right answer, which you can have two right answers. You actually got to pick the best out of those two, I should say, and that might be based upon one keyword in the question and one keyword in the answer. It's also going to lower your anxiety as you walk into that testing site, because you'll feel a little more confident about challenging these computerized tests. And I would additionally say, especially for us who are a little bit elderly, it's going to be even more important to do get familiar with those. Anything from you for tonight, Zach?
Nope, I don't have anything. I'll continue to post announcements on our messenger group and on the Facebook page. Thanks to Bill for covering this. Be sure and get any questions you have over the material to him. And we'll also schedule some time, work on scheduling some time that we can maybe all video chat together about questions over a group of chapters. So we'll figure something out. I don't want to keep you hanging, but yeah, trying to adapt to a new situation.
Yep. Hope this wasn't too bad. First time I've ever done one like this, so I hope it worked for everybody. Have a good night. Stay safe out there.